How could so many people die in one of Britain's most modern football grounds?
And they were just screaming these words where, please God help me. And I believe the girl died. Her face was just blue.
More and more young children are committing serious crimes. What should be done about it?
They are prepared to go out and to flaunt quite openly the fact that they know they cannot be touched.
This woman literally spends $500,000 a year on clothes. On Eyewitness America, I join Ivana Trump at the New York fashion shows. You have to think of a couture dress as sort of like building a house. Good afternoon. Even for a nation that has had to get used to tragedy, yesterday afternoon's events here at Hillsborough in Sheffield were difficult to believe. 108 people perished at the start of what should have been a great British sporting occasion. But there may have been a warning just 2 months ago at an FA Cup tie between Barnsley and Everton. Few people paid attention to the scenes when many people were crushed against a perimeter fence at that game. It may be that Hillsborough was not and will not be a one-off event. Hillsborough, Sheffield. Unlike Bradford City with its 80-year-old wooden stand or Heysel in Belgium, Hillsborough was thought to be one of the best grounds in Britain. That's why it was chosen to stage the semi-final of the FA Cup. There are two clues which may explain why this ground will now always be linked with Bradford and Heysel. The perimeter fencing which rings the pitch at Hillsborough was the solution to a problem. In the 70s, the football authorities were desperate to keep hooligans off the pitch. They erected barriers. In the case of Hillsborough, barriers with spikes to act as a further deterrent. One football chairman even called for the fences at his club to be electrified. It was those fences which prevented the fans at the Lepping Road end from escaping to safety on the pitch. Second, although guidelines for safety in football grounds, the so-called Green Guide, say there should be a maximum of 54 people for every 10 square meters of terracing, it's not unusual for fans to push their way into a ground, or for police to allow them in to prevent trouble outside.
Never even took the stop, just opened the gates. They opened the gates, and they just let us walk in. Didn't even take it off us.
Even at this early stage, there's little doubt it was the combination of perimeter fencing and overcrowding which caused the tragedy. That, together with barriers on the terraces which were not strong enough to prevent the crowd surging forward. In Scotland, the picture is very different. The Scottish FA has banned perimeter fencing precisely because of the dangers. Two of the best supported clubs in Scotland, Aberdeen and Rangers, now have all-seater grounds. A disaster like yesterday's couldn't happen there. But all-seater stadiums are expensive. Rangers cost £12 million. It all reduces ground capacity. Fewer fans, less money for the clubs. In short, few clubs in England could afford to switch. But does that mean England's 92 Football League grounds are all death traps? To try to get an answer to some of those questions, I'm joined by David Pershon, who is leading the investigation into this tragedy for Sheffield City Council, which is the authority in charge of licensing the ground. Mr. Pershon, you've been inside the ground both yesterday and today, and you've had a look round at what happened. Can you tell us what went wrong?
Yes, as reported in the media yesterday and at the Chief Constable's briefing, it is quite clear that a very excessive number of fans have found their way into a very small enclosure in front of the West Stand at Hillsborough, and the pressure has been too much for the stand enclosure to take. And obviously we have been looking at the aftermath of the incident, and we're conducting a series of examinations, and we'll be conducting tests later.
One problem was clearly that the crash barriers on the terraces were inadequate to deal with the pressure placed on them. What is your view about that? Does that imply that there should be a different design?
Well, I don't think you can assume at the moment that the crash barriers were in any way inadequate, because they were in fact all tested last July, and there were no problems identified with any of the crash barriers at that time. They were inspected by the club's consulting engineers. They were subject to test, and they all passed in accordance with the codes of practice. The fact is that if you make a barrier too strong, then it may add to injuries. If it collapses, it may also add to injuries. There was unfortunately probably no other consequence of too many people in the enclosure than the tragedy that has unfolded.
But I think the problem, of course, is that they didn't do the job. Have you had any worries about any of the barriers in the ground?
Yes, at the time that the engineers conducted their test last year, there were problems identified with other safety barriers. They were repaired subsequently, and that was confirmed to the council this morning, that the necessary repairs were undertaken. But the fact is, if you put any mechanical object under sufficient strain, it will collapse, and indeed that is what's happened.
Can you tell me why it was that there was no escape, given that there were that many people in that small area? There are gates at the bottom of the terrace and around the perimeter fence, which are supposedly to let people out.
Yes. Well, obviously, perimeter fences are a problem. They were erected to deal with the problem of pitch invasions, and we have seen the consequences of that in this tragedy. There are gates in the perimeter fencing. They have a satisfactory quick-release mechanism. Those mechanisms are still working this morning as designed. The fact is that they really are designed to let stewards and police go onto the terracing from the pitch. They're not, unfortunately, designed to let people spill onto the pitch.
So there was a problem revealed, I suppose, by this in the design of those perimeter fences.
Yes, as we've all seen in the last few hours, there is a certain amount of controversy surrounding perimeter fences. The council has followed the best practice in having the perimeter fencing in front of the standing terraces.
Mr. Justice Popplewell was the man chosen by the government to set up an inquiry into football safety 3 days after the Bradford fire, which claimed 56 lives. The aim? To restore confidence of millions of people who attend football matches. The Popplewell report made 24 wide-ranging recommendations in all. Just how successful have those recommendations been? Indeed, in light of the Hillsborough disaster, are more needed. Here in the studio with me is Mr. Justice Popplewell, who's agreed to give Eyewitness an exclusive interview. Judge, this is the worst disaster in British sporting history. Why was the death toll so great?
Well, I think it was caused, as we've seen on the television, by the enormous pressure from behind on the fans in front. And given that situation and an enormously large crowd, in a stand which couldn't accommodate all those who were there, I think something like that was inevitable.
But it seems to be being implied that if the perimeter fence hadn't been there, people could spill out onto the ground and lots of people would have been saved.
Well, this is one of the problems with perimeter fencing, and it's really a compromise between controlling hooligans from getting onto the pitch and causing devastation there, and keeping fans in and causing them difficulty if there's this sort of difficulty.
Is there anything that can be done with the perimeter fences then to make them safer and at the same time keep the hooligans at bay?
Well, they were designed with the idea of having exits at numerous points so that if there were an emergency, they could be readily opened and fans could be allowed onto the pitch to escape whatever danger there was. What there was available at this particular ground, I don't know.
The exits that we've actually seen were terribly narrow. I mean, only single-file people could get through, and they were few and far between. I mean, there was no way that the crowd could have escaped out of those exits.
No.
Do you think that needs to be looked at again?
I'm sure that it'll be one of the factors that'll be looked at if there's an inquiry into what happened.
Do you think they're inadequate?
Well, I wouldn't want to express a view without actually knowing the facts.
And what about the crush barriers as well? Because it seems that the one at Hillsborough was a grade A, presumably the top notch, and yet that snapped like a matchstick.
Well, the design of the barriers and the forces which they're designed to protect against are set by a standard. The Home Office set up a working party with the top scientists and engineers and mechanical engineers, and they devised a formula for the structure and strength of these barriers, and one assumes that they've got it right. Whether it was exposed to a totally unforeseen pressure, really I don't know.
So do you think it needs to be revised, or this is the best we're ever going to get?
Well, I suspect there's a limit to the force that a barrier can sustain.
The other problem seems to have been that there was a lack of, certainly, stretchers, because the fans were ripping the hoardings down to carry the injured. And are there standard provisions for medical facilities?
Well, the Green Code, which is the code set up by the Home Office, lays down that each club shall have first aid facilities. Of course, the quality of those facilities will vary from club to club. And of course, one has to recognise it isn't a hospital, and therefore to have stretchers for over 100 people simply wouldn't be possible.
Now, you've obviously looked at this in great detail previously. What do you think the government should do now? Are there any further recommendations?
Well, I think the first thing is to find out what happened. I think it's too soon to make a judgment on incomplete facts. I know people like to have an answer immediately to what happened. I think the first thing is to have a quiet, restrained inquiry into what happened, ascertain exactly what went wrong.
Now, talking of what happened, the police have admitted that somebody actually opened the door, but several of the fans said that if they hadn't opened the door, the crowd was going to be out of control, potential injuries and fatalities. Do you think the police responded correctly? Is this the norm, to open the doors when they have this sort of crowd problem?
Well, again, this is on incomplete facts. They had to make a judgment on the spot. If the position was that there was a real danger to fans outside, and they thought there was less danger by admitting them, that was a policy decision for the man on the spot.
I understand also that one of the policies is that the terraces should be cleared within 2.5 minutes. Now, clearly, that was an impossibility yesterday at Hillsborough. Do you think that needs to be looked at again? Well,
the 2.5 minutes was the time set out for an emergency clearance, given that everybody's standing normally on the terraces. In the situation which obtained at Hillsborough, plainly that wasn't relevant at all.
No, because it was impossible at Hillsborough
impossible,
yesterday.
Yes.
Absolutely. And is there anything now, I go back to my previous question, that you think the government ought to be looking at to stop Hillsborough, which was one of the top 3 stadiums in the country?
Well, until we know what happened, I think it's impossible to express any view as to what recommendations should be made. If you arrive, as I suspect what happened in this case, with 3,000 or 4,000 supporters who haven't got tickets who want to get in, that's always going to cause trouble.
So do you think there's always a potential Hillsborough disaster around the corner?
There's always a danger when you get large crowds anywhere. I mean, whether it's at a football match or Oxford Circus Underground Station at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon.
But you're always going to get a large crowd at this sort of match,
yes,
particularly.
Yes.
I mean, what's the answer then? Because it's an all-ticket match as well. So everything that was possible seems to have been done, and yet this still happens.
Well, how do you stop 4,000 people, if that be the figure, turning up who haven't got tickets and want to get in?
Well, I suppose you stop the match, do you?
I don't know.
I mean, do you think this is a problem with football generally, that perhaps we're going to have to take a look at football again and see whether we can accommodate these huge crowds?
Well, there is a view that a football match, which is after all a private entertainment for private profit for the football club and the football league, requires a great deal of policing. It costs a great deal of public money for a very small number of the community to take part in. It attracts large crowds, which are likely to cause danger. You've got all the hooligan problems. I think it is a matter where it needs to be looked at again, whether we can any longer go on having these great crowds of people every Saturday afternoon at football matches.
Do you think Scotland's got the answer? Because up there, they do have huge crowds, yet they don't have the perimeter fences. And yesterday, what was so appalling was seeing many of them children, their faces crushed against the wire, and also then trying to climb over the spikes, and it was horrendous. Do you think Scotland's got the answer?
Well, I think, again, this question of perimeter fencing is a very difficult one because you have got the problem of hooligans. And we've found you've got to have some control to prevent them getting onto the pitch and fighting with other hooligans. So far as seating is concerned, which they showed in Scotland, that's been tried here. I mean, Coventry some years ago decided to have an all-seating. All that happened was the fans broke up the seats and used them as weapons against the other supporters. So it's not necessarily the answer.
Would you now, as a parent, feel safe sending children to any big match, in fact, any sporting event at all?
I wouldn't have allowed my children to go to any football match in the last 5 years.
You wouldn't, because
No.
it's unsafe?
Yes.
Well,
Not particularly because of what happened yesterday, but because of the hooliganism.
well, thank you very much indeed, Judge. I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave it there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's still less than 24 hours since these appalling scenes at Hillsborough. 24 hours in which there has already been considerable speculation about why the tragedy happened and how we can stop anything like it happening again. But for 108 people, their families and friends, that discussion is too late.
Terms, if people are being pressed into one area, is there an escape